Okay, so Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model, sometimes his theory is referred to as ecological systems theory. You'll find it as that in your text. Um, it gets at the interrelations between individuals and their environments. Now, Bronfenbrenner, he was a theorist, and his famous quote is this: "Much of developmental psychology, as it now exists, is the science of the strange behavior of children in strange situations with strange adults for the briefest possible periods of time." And what he means by this is that kind of our methods that we have to assess and observe children's behavior can create some very artificial environments. We bring kids into a laboratory, we observe them. There are researchers that the children don't know, these strange people, and it all affects behavior. So the behavior that we actually observe may not be natural behavior that tells us very much about development at all. And so what Urie Bronfenbrenner was interested in was the natural environments that children emerge in, and he kind of put this model together of multiple systems of influence in children's lives. So here's a depiction of his model, quite similar to the one you'll find in your text, where he talks about these different layers of systems. It's sometimes referred to as an onion model because they kind of build on each other. So at the very center of the model, you'll see the child exists within the microsystem. Now, the microsystem is anything that a child has consistent, direct contact with, usually on a daily basis. So these are things that directly influence child behavior, child emotionality, child well-being. These are direct influences. So things like the family, relationships with siblings and parents, things like school. If a child goes off to school every day, daycare, if the child has that consistent interaction in a daycare facility, then daycare would be part of that child's microsystem. Now, every child has maybe a different picture of what their microsystem looks like. If a child doesn't go to daycare, then daycare wouldn't be part of their microsystem. So I want you to understand that those microsystem influences are direct influences, and typically they're the strongest influences. If I were to ask you what was the thing or who was the person that most influenced you in your life and got you to the point where you are today, as you think of those things, most likely the things that you're thinking about fall within the microsystem. The mesosystem, I think that this is one that many of you struggled with on the quiz. The mesosystem is connections between microsystems. The mesosystem is connections between microsystems. What does that mean? Basically, how well do the many influences in a child's microsystem support each other? So think about that, connections between microsystems. So family is an aspect of the microsystem, and school is an aspect of the microsystem. And so what is the connection between family and school? If the school has high standards of academic achievement, and the family also has high standards of academic achievement, then that is a strong support between microsystems, and that connection between the family and the school is thought of as a mesosystem. So you can think, say that, so church, if a child goes to church regularly, and peers, those are both aspects of the microsystem. Let's say that a child's interaction at church teaches one set of standards, and their interactions with peers teaches another set of standards. That's a very weak connection between microsystems, but that connection, still the same, is a mesosystem between church and peers. And so a lot of research supports that when connections between microsystems, when the mesosystems are strong, that facilitates the best outcomes in children. And that makes sense, right? I mean, if children are getting different messages and there's different standards of expectations and rules and things in every microsystem, that can be very confusing to a child. They can kind of develop this duality. That happens often in cases where children of divorced parents have one set of expectations at one parent's house and another set of expectations at another parent's house. That's not a very strong connection between those microsystems. That mesosystem is weak. And so that can facilitate some poor developmental outcomes. So the microsystem is direct influences. The mesosystem is connections between microsystems. The exosystems are indirect influences on children's development. So things that maybe the child doesn't come into direct contact with, but still influence the child. So for example, a parent's workplace. The child probably doesn't go to parent's workplace very much, so it's not part of their microsystem, but it still influences that child. I want you to think about how that influences the child. So if mom goes off to work and she has a supportive boss and she has positive interactions with her coworkers and she's fulfilled by what she does, and then she comes home, that kind of carries over into her interactions with her child, that positivity. Whereas if she goes off to work and there's lots of demands that she can't meet, and there's policies that make her more stressed, and she doesn't have a very positive experience at work, then that also carries over into her interactions with her child. So that's an example of an exosystem influence, more indirect influences on child development. Now this model has extended family. Here's a picture of a grandparent with a child. They have that relationship in the exosystem, but honestly, that very much depends on the child. Some children grow up with their grandparents as part of their microsystem, as part of that consistent direct contact day to day. Some children maybe see their grandparents on holidays, and so they have more of an indirect influence on them. And so they would be part of the exosystem for some children. The macrosystem, you can see here, is described as broad ideologies of the surrounding people, laws and customs of one's culture, subculture, or social class. So the macrosystem influences the child by kind of delineating what the policies, what the laws, what's appropriate in terms of cultural attitudes and behaviors. But again, there's not a direct influence. The child's not involved in making those laws. The lawmakers are not necessarily thinking of that child specifically when they're making those laws, but still those laws and parts of the culture are influencing the child. So kind of those broad ideologies are what make up the macro system. And one last system that Bronfenbrenner talks about is the chronosystem. Here we have the chronosystem, and that's just the time element, how time can influence children differently. So as children age, then things influence them differently. They understand things differently. So if they experience the loss of a sibling as a toddler versus as an adolescent, then that experience is going to be significant for them at each age, but it's going to influence them differently at each age. And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about the chronosystem. Okay, so now understanding those different systems that we've just talked about. So look at these examples, and each of these represents one of well, I should say as an example of one of Bronfenbrenner's systems that we just talked about. So go ahead and pause your screencast right now and see what you would identify each of these examples as being part of what system. And then you can play your screencast and we'll go through them. So Lizzie has adjusted to her parents' divorce better than her younger sister has. That would be an aspect of the chronosystem, because like we just talked about how the age at which an influence happens will influence a child differently. That's the chronosystem. Lena's parents want her to go to church, but her friends are pressuring her to skip. That's an aspect of the mesosystem. Remember, connections between microsystems. Church is in the microsystem and friends are in the microsystem, and the connections between those two. Lucy loves school and feels like it has really helped shape who she is. That is an example of a microsystem influence. Laura's dad got a big promotion at work and now works much longer hours. That's an example of an exosystem influence, an indirect influence that what's going on at Dad's work is likely also influencing Laura. Lindsay is not from the United States, but since she's been here, she has been celebrating Christmas and Easter and trying to acclimate herself to these customs. That's an example of a macrosystem influence. So hopefully examples like this and practices like this help kind of clarify some of those details surrounding the ecological systems theory.